Hello, I'm Sean O'Leary, this is the Planners Podcast, and my guest today is the Secretary-General of the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment, Oonagh Buckley.
We work within the planning system. We know that we have to make the planning system work for us and that there's a structure there that can do that. Governance is about making sure that there are checks and balances within an organisation. That just didn't exist in the old structure of the board. All the power was concentrated in quite a small number of individuals.
On today's episode, we'll cover a multitude of topics with Oonagh, including climate action and renewables and her department's role in planning, both terrestrial and marine, her experience as a civil servant rolling out the Planning and Development Act way back in 2000, and what it might mean for the new legislation, and of course we'll discuss her time as interim chair of Pleanála, just as that organisation is now becoming An Comisiún. Oonagh, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks very much, Sean, and looking forward to doing what for me is a first.
Oonagh, on the 2nd of June, the name of your department changed from being the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications to its new name, which is the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. Can you start by explaining a bit more about that and what your core functions are now?
As you say, as of the 2nd of June, our name changed because the communications function, that was essentially digital infrastructure, broadband and so forth, and the cyber functions that I was responsible for have moved to two other departments. The Department of Culture, Communications and Sport, in one hand, that's their new name, and the Department of Justice and Home Affairs, also a new name. So we're left with some very complementary functions in terms of climate and energy. The line to follow in Europe is that we decarbonise our electricity system and then we electrify everything we can. So our core function here to help deliver on the climate agenda is very much to decarbonise the energy system, and we're very well advanced in moving along that path. Stopped burning peat for electrical energy a couple of years ago. This month, we're going to get out of the business of burning coal for energy, and we're converting money point oil. Still a fossil fuel, but a much less carbon hungry fossil fuel. So our energy system is decarbonising rapidly.
Okay, but what are the effects of those changes in real terms?
Our electricity system is now up to about 40% across a year of renewable energy integration. And we are capable of, on any one day, of having about 70% of the electricity system and renewables, which is a really high proportion. We're Europe leaders in integrating onshore renewable energies into our electricity grid. Not a statistic you often hear. We try and say it as frequently as possible, but it's something that I think that people aren't aware of. We also have acquired responsibilities in the recent past for maritime planning, which I know will be of interest to your listeners. We're about to acquire responsibility for maritime environment. So getting the full suite of responsibilities on the maritime agenda, which is very exciting and very much fits with what's happening at the European level in terms of maritime spatial planning.
And where's that now? And is that
currently in housing, Department of Housing, yeah.
And this is all separate to the marine, which stays with DAFN, but that's more...
Marine is fisheries really, fishing and aquaculture, whereas maritime planning and the maritime arena obviously encompasses no more than the land use planning system. It encompasses all activities in the marine environment. So we'll be responsible for DMAPs, not just for offshore wind, but all forms of DMAPPing. So if there's a DMAP for telecommunications infrastructure, for example, which is subsea, or if we decided to do a DMAP for aquaculture, or if the Department of Agriculture decided to do one, we would help them plan for that. So with the marine environment responsibilities coming over, the responsibility for marine protected areas, which is a very big agenda where we have to protect or designate 30% of our sea area by 2030. So that area will also come and rest under this department. So a really exciting time.
And there's loads there that we can get back into over the next while. But I wanted to take you back, I guess, to earlier in your career in 2000. You were involved in the Planning and Development Act 2000. Can you just describe a little bit about your role at the time and maybe just even what that legislation was trying to achieve? I mean, obviously it was a much smaller piece of legislation than the Planning and Development Act.
Actually, my first job was, and this is a real piece of history now, helping to draft the terms of reference for the Commission of Inquiry, the Tribunal of Inquiry into the planning system and acts of corruption, what became the Flood Tribunal. And many years later, I was responsible for amending the terms of reference so that the flood tribunal would eventually come to an end, because the terms of reference were so broadly drafted initially. We had, of course, thought it would all be over by Christmas, but as with so many things, they were due to end by Christmas. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
So, in fact, the first piece of legislation I worked on when I was there was the protected structures legislation, so the architecture and heritage legislation. But Minister Noel Dempsey was the minister at the time, and there was a strong view that the planning system, and this will sound familiar to your listeners, needed to be overhauled and was very slow and was slowing down development. And the big pressure at the time was very much around housing. So the concern was to try and gather up what had been a number of different pieces of legislation passed since the original 1963 Act and bring it all together into a single piece of legislation, as well as significantly amending it and reforming it. Some parts of it were, I suppose, lift and drop, including, as it happens, the provisions around on board Pleanála, which have been relatively recently reformed in 1992. Other parts were completely new. So, for example, the enforcement provisions, which I think have largely stayed intact as they moved over to the 24 Act. So that would have been one of the areas that I was the primary on, working on the enforcement provisions. There were many controversial bits, but the most controversial, of course, was Part 5, which was the revision for social and affordable housing. That went through many iterations. I remember we had a lot of conversations with counterparts in the UK who were looking at some similar provisions at that time in London in particular. But ours was very unusual and unique, particularly because obviously we work in a constitutional context where there's not one but two protections for private property in the Constitution. And this had to be very carefully constructed so as to meet the constitutional requirements of being proportionate and fair and targeted. And it was referred by the President to the Supreme Court under the relevant provisions of the Constitution for checking to see if it was constitutional. So having trained to be a barrister, the only time I've ever actually been in the Supreme Court working on a case was acting as the support to the then Attorney General, Michael McDowell, still very much a name around the place, and his two supports, one of whom is now the Chief Justice, as they defended this particular piece of legislation before the Supreme Court. And it survived that challenge. It was deemed to be constitutional by the Supreme Court.
And that wasn't drag and drop with the regs. These were a whole new set of regs, I guess.
Myself and two other colleagues, very good colleagues, Trina and Frank, we wrote this extraordinary piece of regulation. And we did bits of it at a time. But the big piece, obviously, was the exempted development regs. And I suppose those were the things that really people went backwards and forwards over in terms of what would be permitted exempted development regulations under the legislation. A lot of those things that are now, I suppose, people are so used to, the 25 square metres in the back garden and all that, that's what we wrote in. And they seem to have lasted a very long time. I was surprised to see the sorts of things that were still in force when I came back into the planning world, having left it for so long, that there were still things that I had done or worked on, not least the wind energy guidelines, that were still in force so many years later and still doing their job.
That's really interesting in terms of the exempted development regs, because obviously that's very current now. Were you surprised at how much it grew? Because I suppose that's the one thing, just looking at it in terms of pure numbers, just how long it became, how many sections had to add it to it.
I was and I wasn't, I suppose it would be fair to say. It's worth pointing out that we did the 2000 Act, but I ended up doing a 2001 Act, a 2003 Act. Then I did the 2006 Strategic Infrastructure Development legislation. That was my last hurrah in terms of the primary code. So the 2000 Act was already being amended a year later. I then moved on to work in the habitats area in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And that integration of habitats assessments and things really was at its start of its implications for the planning code back then, but it was clear it was going to become a bigger and bigger issue, not least because the European Commission had taken multiple cases against us on our imperfect implementation of both the habitats and the birds directives. Even then as well, we were starting to get embroiled in the issue around quarries and what having permissions for quarries that had been there since before the 1963 Act even started, but trying to give them retention permission as they grew. And that issue around EIA and appropriate assessment for quarries And it was just getting more and more complex. So that had started when I moved away from the planning code in 2006. So it has got a lot more complex. There's no question about that. But regulation has got a lot more complex in the intervening years. I look back now and think it felt complex then, but actually, in comparison to what people are dealing with now and what the team in the Custom House have dealt with over the last number of years in terms of pulling together this enormous piece of primary legislation and trying to make it coherent internally and so forth, it's a remarkable piece of work, and they should feel very proud of themselves actually, because they've done a great job. In fact, they've just won a Civil Service Excellence Awards for their job on the Primary Act, which is well deserved, I think. Even proofreading that legislation, I suspect, was a huge job. So it doesn't really surprise me. Should it be that way? I don't know, but the world has got more complex. I mean, Europe is undergoing one of its periodic assessments of whether it does need to regulate so much. And a huge amount now of our legislation does come from Europe. So not least, that's really where a lot of this is coming from. And it doesn't surprise me that our system is kind of creaking at the seams a little bit in terms of trying to cope with that pressure.
And then what was your memory of what happened once the new system and the new regs actually came into force?
My memory is that there was a huge surge of applications in under the old system, and then a long pause while people looked at each other and didn't want to be the first to apply under the new act.
So your parting gift maybe to the system back then was the strategic infrastructure legislation, and again something that I suppose has endured. But if we fast forward then to the start of 2023, you were appointed interim chair of On Board Pleanála after having a lot of very senior roles across the civil service and public service in between. I don't know if you can answer this, but do you get a phone call and do you just say, we have an issue with a very key part of the public service that we'd like you to go into? Was it kind of an expressions of interest process?
How does one's shoulder get tapped? Obviously, I had been watching with a great deal of concern the stories coming out of the board, because, I still kept an eye on what happened in the planning system, and the Board Pleanála was always the jewel in the crown of the system, and it had been very ably led over the years, including up to the current times. And I had worked with Dave Walsh actually in the Custom House, so I knew Dave, and I messaged him a couple of times, just a couple of messages of support to say, I was thinking of him and so forth. And then he stepped down to obviously everybody's great surprise. So there had been a couple of jokes in my department then, which is the Department of Justice, saying, oh, they'll be looking for you. And I was going, oh yeah, haha. And something I'd been working on for my whole time in the Department of Justice, the Family Justice Strategy, which is about setting up family courts in Ireland, which is long overdue. And it's great to see it's proceeding. We had just launched the strategy. I'd been working on it and a team of people working for me for a number of years. And we were having a celebratory lunch in Doheny and Nesbitt's, of course, because it's round the corner, and they do a good lunch. And my phone rang. It was my boss. So, of course, one always thinks when you're caught sort of having a social event during the working day, oh no, I'm busted, even if you're that senior in a civil service. But she said they wanted to talk to me in Taoiseach's. And I obviously got quite a shock. So I walked over to Taoiseach's, and the head of the civil service, John Calman, asked me, would I go and take over On Board Pleanála? Obviously, I got quite a shock. But firstly, I'm a civil servant. And if you're asked by the head of the civil service, and indeed, he said, ultimately, obviously, it'll be up to the minister to decide to appoint you in the government. But he said, would you be willing to let your name go forward? So when you're a civil servant and the government asks you to do something, you'd say yes. That's kind of the long and the short of it. I also inherently felt that while it was a huge problem and was going to be extremely challenging, it was undoubtedly a problem that could be resolved. Like the board had to remain in place, it had to keep doing its job, and it was a fixable problem. Now, there were a few steps to go through. I hadn't at that point met Minister Darragh O'Brien, who was the Minister for Housing at the time, now Minister here, of course. So I met him, and so he could talk to me and see whether he felt that I was an appropriate person to do it. And then, of course, my name had to go to Cabinet to appoint that. I had been asked to come over and start the job that I had needed a couple of weeks to extricate myself from my current role in the Department of Justice, but that I would be arriving in a couple of weeks. So I actually started in December. They had to amend the legislation underpinning An Bord Pleanála to permit my appointment as chair. So initially I was appointed as an ordinary member, which the minister could do, and then I was promoted as deputy chair. I wasn't actually made the interim chair until January, which is when the legislation came into force. When I wrote the strategic infrastructure legislation, I never envisaged there would ever be an era where the board would be without a chair or a deputy chair. And the legislation, the SID legislation in particular, required there to be either a chair or a deputy chair in situ to determine the business of the board. So it wasn't legally possible for the board to take a whole host of decisions, including those critical decisions on strategic infrastructure that are so vital to the country and indeed to me in my current role in terms of delivery of major renewable energy projects.
How did you decide what you wanted to do first?
So I had two priorities. I had to get the staff of the board to know me, trust me, and start fully functioning again. And then the second priority was to start resourcing the board. I'll deal with the second aspect first and I'll come back to the staff. When I started in December, there were only a residual number of board members left, and two of them were stepping down in February. And had that happened with no replacements for them, the board would only have been quorate if I had sat in every board decision, so that we would have been left with two functioning board members plus me, which was not acceptable. The department had already been looking for civil servants to come over, and I did a few phone calls saying to people, you might be interested in this. This could be good. I'm going in, so I might need a bit of support. And I'm delighted to say that three really excellent civil servants stuck their hands up and said, yes, we will come in. And we trained them as fast as we could, because had they not arrived, and they all started in the beginning of January, had they not done so, as I say, to have a quorate board for any decision, I'd have had to sit in on all the decisions, which just, with everything I needed to do internally, just wasn't going to be feasible. We had three civil servants who were very good civil servants and had various backgrounds that were helpful, but had never made a planning decision. So they needed to have a lot of support to bring them up to speed on how to go about assessing the reports given to them by the planners and the various evidential background, and then presenting the report for a decision to their fellow board members. When we did a second round, then went out to both local authorities and to the civil service and got a further group of excellent people who came in over the course of March, April, May. So we were back up and running with now an increased group of board decision makers, many of them experienced local authority officials with a planning background, but not all. And we also appointed a couple of internal people who were experienced planners. So that mixture of external people and experienced planners meant we could get the board decision system back up and running. So that was key. That was critical. We had to do that because, it was astonishing, the backlog we had. The worst, I think, the peak we hit of the backlog was in April, May, as you'd expect, because the board members are just onboarding and the files are still coming up the line. So, it was to try and manage that. But the key thing I needed to do internally was to build up trust with the staff of the board, who had their trust in their organisation, their employer, very badly shaken, and to get them to trust me and work with me to get the board back flowing and moving again. So I spent a number of weeks initially having individual one-on-ones initially with the leadership team. And then I met the staff of the board. So that would call it the sort of 180 people who were then working there, who were in all ranks, planners and the administrative staff. I met about a dozen of each of three groups, which is planners, processing, were the people who bring in all the planning appeals and do the processing work. And then it's sort of the rest of corporate, if I could put it that way, HR, finances and so forth. I met each of those groups and then spoke to them about what they needed from me and how they had experienced what the board had gone through. I also asked everybody from an accounting officer perspective, was there anything I needed to know that hadn't yet come out? Thankfully, nothing big was revealed, but that was an important question to ask. But, to talk to people about what they needed from the leadership of the organisation to give them confidence again in their employers. And the big thing was communication. What I heard from the staff was that they nobody really had been talking to them about what was going on. And they had actually ended up getting a lot of their information about their own employer from the internet, which is not the place to get reliable information about anywhere. So I committed to them that they would hear frequently from me, that they would hear news from me. If there was any developments in any of the things going on, they would hear it from me first. Nothing I did was rocket science. I started doing town halls, and we did a staff sort of mood survey, which was some of the worst results I've ever seen in the public service in January of that year, but you'd expect that. One of the things I'm proudest about, actually, is that by the time I left the board in September, the mood of the staff had transformed. You know, they always respected working in the organisation, but it was more that the environment around them had changed so much, and they had much greater confidence in the leadership team. They had much greater visibility of the board members. They knew us all. I often tell the story that where the smokers used to go was past my office, and I have an open door policy. I only close my door when I'm having a meeting with somebody and people can't hear me. And so by the end of my time, I knew every smoker in the building because they would go past my door and go, hi, Oonagh, hi, Oonagh, hi, Oonagh. So in some respects, what I did sounds a bit silly. I used to go around, I'd walk one floor every day. I first of all, I went back into the office of there 5 days a week because they needed somebody to be there. They needed visible leadership, I thought. I walked around, asked people how they were getting on. People saw me regularly. And I said things like, I can promise you that 2023 will be a better year than 2022, as was an easy enough promise to make. And it was to help and to deal with this big backlog of work. It's actually the thing I'm most proud of is that the staff, by the end, the staff both trusted me, I hope, and they also were feeling better about where they worked, and the resources were starting to arrive, for which, by the way, you have to thank the Department of Housing, who shifted heaven and earth to help push for the case for more resources for On Board Pleanála. I think the case had pretty much been made, but they were really concerned to make sure that they could help resource the organisation, which is key. I suppose it would be remiss of me not to also mention the Code of Conduct, which was a very big deal, and we worked very hard in getting a modern, up-to-date Code of Conduct in for On Board Pleanála, and I think we did quite a good job there as well. So,
and then structurally, from your perspective, given the increased complexity maybe of governance and stuff like that, I presume you're satisfied that changing how it's structured makes sense.
100%. In fact, I contributed heavily to the drafting of the part of the Act that develops on Commission Pleanála. In 1992, the way the board was constituted with nominating board members and things like that was relatively up to date. It was quite modern. It was a step above the minister just appointing people that they knew. But there's been a huge shift in governance and appointments since then, particularly after the economic downturn. And the governance arrangements with On Board Pleanála hadn't kept pace with those developments. And although the board had tried its best to meet the requirements for state boards and the governance arrangements for state boards, it just wasn't feasible. And the thing about governance is that governance gives you multiple people with power in an organisation. So if something goes wrong with one of those areas of power, you can go to someone else. So the staff would have had someone to go to who was separate to the core leadership to air concerns if they had concerns. That just didn't exist in the old structure of the board, that because all the power was concentrated in quite a small number of individuals, there wasn't a separate board that you could take your concerns to. And I think that governance is about making sure that there are checks and balances within an organisation to make sure that, structures work as they ought to. And the thing about any organisation is it works fine until it doesn't. It works fine until a weakness is found. The flaw in the governance didn't help then when what happened. So it's really important that structure works effectively and well. I'm sure it will. I know that the Department of Housing is working very hard to get really effective board members in there who will do their job properly. The mantra is noses in and fingers out. So you allow the executive team do their job and make the decisions and all that sort of stuff, but you make sure that you're watching and you're putting in place good governance structures and a balance of structures for people. So I think it'll work fine. I strongly suspect that the staff will barely notice. The leadership team will notice all right. And they'll have a separate group of people that they will be managing and we'll be managing conversations with. And I also strongly suspect that it'll take a while before people get used to the new name. I suspect we'll still be calling it An Bord Pleanála for a few years yet.
And the new name wasn't your idea, or that wasn't one of your contributions to the legislation, no?
That was from the department, from the minister. Yeah.
And if we, I suppose, moving on to the departments then, just in the time we have available, and this is nerdy, but I do like looking at the briefings that new ministers prepare, and I have to say that the then DEC one was one of the nicest and the best layout, and it was a beautiful briefing document anyway, and supporting presentations and everything.
I shall pass on here congratulations to the corporate office.
There we go. Because I think there was one minister change when I was there, and I can't remember if my sentence made it into the briefing. But that briefing document is talking about RED 3, it's talking about LARES, it's talking about noise, renewable energy strategies, marine, environmental NGOs, the Planning and Development Act 2021. And then on the other side, if we're just focusing on the energy kind of side of this, you get the Climate Change Advisory Council saying that planning reform is needed to meet our wind and our solar targets. You've got the Draghi report saying that we've got some of the kind of longest planning consent processes in Europe for solar PV and all these things. How important is the planning system to what DC is trying to do? And how do you try and influence or work with the planning system, having your own internal planning divisions and stuff like that as well? How does that all work? And is it unusual to have a department so heavily invested in a system that is ultimately a lot of which outside its control?
We work within the planning system, right? So we know that we have to make the planning system work for us, and that there's a structure there that can do that. And, that's where we're at now. So it is certainly a system that can work for people, but you have to deal with it with expertise. One thing that we're going to be very reliant on is the new national planning framework, which includes quite a lot of language. And we work very closely with the Department of Housing on this around renewable energy, because we know that a lot will now cascade down from the national framework into the regional strategies and then on into the city and county development plans. So it's critically important for us that flow of targets happens through the system, so we don't get the sort of discrepancies across county boundaries that I think have been a source of some frustration to the system, to An Bord Pleanála, for example, or indeed to the renewable energy industry. And they also get things wrong about the planning system. They sometimes apply in very much the wrong place. But overall, I think it suits everybody to have a clear and consistent policy regime that we can all work within. So we're trying to work with the Department of Housing colleagues and across the system at the regional level and down into the county level to try and deliver what the country has committed to in terms of its renewable energy goals. You mentioned Draghi. Draghi talks about all permitting processes, not just what the Irish Planning Institute calls planning. So we also have to work on some of the consenting systems that are within our sector. So one of them, for example, has been the openings for EirGrid for connections to the grid. That's now gone up to 2 connection cycles a year. So it's making sure that all the consenting systems operate in an alignment to work together. And one of the areas that's then under our auspices that we have to deliver is the transposition of the RED 2 and RED 3 directives. Again, working very closely with colleagues in the Department of Housing. And the timing has been a little unlucky for them because they've ended up having to amend the regulations under the old system, and then they're going to have to transpose it under the new act as well. So very challenging to try and get all the bits and pieces working in tandem to deliver on the what we need to do under those 2 directives. And we're under the cosh from the Commission on that. We have a complaint from the Commission on RED 2 transposition in particular. So we're working very hard to try and deliver on those transpositions. So critically important that we get the framework and the structures right. Then underneath that, we're going to need wind energy guidelines. And obviously that'll now be a planning statement, I think they're called, under the new system. And we're also going to need solar planning guidelines, actually, because solar renewable is one of the big growth areas. And both of those are identified in the programme for government. So, I mean, there's a clear line of sight about the agenda that we all need to follow, at least for the renewable energy space. And one thing I think is really interesting is that the leadership team and on board Pleanála now are producing really good statistics about the applications being made and the grants and refusals of wind energy or renewable energy projects. And that's really helpful in terms of the data that we're seeing. So for as long as I've known anything about planning, people have been complaining about delays in the planning system. Some of that is absolutely true, right? There's no question, and there's no question that timelines and things like that in a property resource system, can work to bring certainty to people. But it's important as well that we make sure that we don't just say it's all planning's fault. There are other aspects to the system that we can make work more smoothly, whether that's, if you like, regulator consents and things like that. And we also need to make sure, and I'd be a big exponent for this, we need to make sure that the system is properly resourced. So we're requiring consenting authorities, and I'd include the National Parks and Wildlife Service here, where I worked also for 18 months. Consents only move at the speed of the narrowest bit of the pike. So if any part of the pipeline is narrow, that's the speed at which the system will progress. So you've got to make sure that the pipeline is sufficiently resourced to make sure that the consents can move along it. I have been really taken, though, by the fact that a lot of the decisions that on board Pleanála are deciding, for example, they're making decisions this month on applications that were made in November and December last year. So there's been a real turnaround there. The other bit of the pipeline, unfortunately, and very specifically in Ireland, that needs to be resourced is, of course, the courts, because we do have a proportion of decisions, a relatively small proportion, to be fair, but they tend to be quite high profile, the ones that are challenged. You also need to make sure that you have adequate resources into the planning and environmental list in the High Court to make sure that that is resourced to give its decisions quickly. Judicial review are sort of an inevitable part of the Irish system, although there have been a lot more of them in recent years than was previously the case. But in making sure that they get decided quickly, you have to make sure that the resources are in the courts to do that.
And am I right in saying you were involved in the setting up of the Planning and Environmental Court in that in-between phase between the department and the board as well? So
my last big job in the Department of Justice was achieving sign-off on a report that was done about judicial resources. The deal was to try and manage reforms of how we manage our judicial resources rather than just adding in extra judges into an inefficient system. So it was a kind of a balancing act between improving the efficiencies of the system and then adding resources into the system. And actually with all public bodies, including the court system, whether it's on board Pleanála or indeed my own department here, it isn't just a matter of adding resources into inefficient systems. You also have to deal with the inefficiencies in those systems and try and drive them out as quickly as you can to make sure that these, when you add resources to the system, they actually are there to improve the speed or the capacity.
And just on that JR thing, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but something that did strike me was when you were in front of one of the Oireachtas committees, when you were in the board, you implied that really we now have longer reports and more detail, and there's conceivably a better, more efficient way of doing all this.
It certainly is the case that the jurisprudence around administrative bodies taking decisions is that they have to give reasons. And just as the law has got more complex, the reasoning has got more complex. And it has got to the stage now where inspectors are writing 200- and 300-page reports in a board Pleanála. Even the decisions of the board can be 20 pages long. You know, we grant this or we refuse this, and here are the many, many reasons that we're doing one or the other, and trying to encompass all the many details that come into that. The system is just very, very complex. Now, I did try and do some work with the inspectorate team while I was in the board about trying to write simpler decisions, even for the simpler cases, you know, maybe not your renewable energy cases or anything involving EIA, but stuff that's, you know, more routine, more domestic, and could we get shorter decisions in that space? I'm not sure what happened to that work. I hope it continued, because it was to deal with the efficiency of the system as well. Like if you're getting planning permission or you're being refused planning permission as an individual, you need to know the core reasons for that, particularly if you're getting a refusal, because you need to know, well, if I fix those things, If they're fixable, then I might get planning permission the next time round, Look, the system has just got incredibly complex. I used to use as an example, when I was there, I had a photograph. I asked the team just to pick me any wind farm development and the boxes of files associated with it. So they picked me out a 10 turbine. I don't know, it was 5 turbine wind development. I have no idea where it was. I just said, pick me any, because we had so many at that point waiting to be decided in the board. And I put it up on a cupboard, and I took a photograph of the banker's boxes worth of papers associated with that. And then the file that was the inspector's report on top of it, which was, more than 100 pages long. And then when I was talking to colleagues in public expenditure or in the Department of Housing or whatever, and they were saying, why can't you make decisions quickly? I would say, would you like to read this and produce a report? Do you think any human being could read that level of material in less than a month and regurgitate it in some sort of usable form? So the system, it's extraordinarily complex. And I do feel sorry for the individuals, both at local authority level. Let's not forget them. I mean, I'm more used to the board, but at local authority level who have to go through all of this material, and at board level who have to look through all this material and then look through all the various government policies and structures and frameworks and so forth that can have relevance to that, including the climate action plan, as we know, and then try and ensure that the decision they take meets the requirements of all of those things and is up to date, so they don't miss the fact that maybe in the last week a new structure, a new framework, a new policy, a new decision has come out that has implications for the decision that they take. It's incredibly difficult to do. And I'm not sure within the complexity of the system that we work, whether there's much we can do. It's a very difficult structure to navigate.
Talk about barriers and consenting processes and maybe it not all being about planning. Something else that is a live issue maybe is, and the programme for government talks about the need for investment in the grid, and what sort of scale investment are we looking at, and how big a deal is grid capacity?
So we're currently engaged in the discussions around major capital investments, whether under the National Development Plan for 26 to 30 or otherwise. And so a huge ask of us, of the system, is a big capital investment into the companies providing grid. So that's Airgrid and ESB. And those discussions are ongoing at the moment. I don't know when this podcast is going to come out, but the announcement may have been made, I hope, assuming it's agreed, by the time this podcast comes out. There's also a process done by the regulator, the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, or CRU, where they do a thing called a price review every 5 years. And they're currently in the process of drawing up Price Review 6, it's called. The current asks of the two companies of that price review is of an investment, a capital investment into grid reinforcement and extension that is of multiples of previous investments. So Price Review 5 was 2005, and that had so many billions went in capital investment. This will be about 4 times that size for the next 5 years, if it can be built out in that time. And that is investment that is not just to accommodate renewables, although it will also do that. It is to increase the capacity of the grid, particularly around our major urban areas, especially Dublin, where it's very constrained. And then it's also to improve the resilience of the grid. And obviously we went through the effects of Storm Éowyn in January. At one point, 1 million premises across this island were without electrical power, 3/4 of them in the Republic and the others in the north. The companies, ESB, did amazing work to restore power, but it still took weeks to get power back to the last few premises, in very, very difficult circumstances for those people. So we know that we have to now invest very much into our grid for its resilience in the face of climate change. Our storms are not getting more frequent, but they are getting more powerful. And our grid is vulnerable to that. And obviously we recently had the EPA report talking about risks, and their real risk, and we all know it because we lived through Storm Éowyn, is that the power supply that we need is vulnerable to the very thing that we have caused. That means we have to increase our electrical supply. So that investment in the next 5 years, and indeed in the decades to come, in grid is absolutely needed. an argument we've been making, and an argument in fairness that the government has listened to, because there is a clear indication in the programme for government of a need to invest in utilities, including electrical grid. Really, really important. I cannot understate the importance of that investment. It will mean that households and businesses will be paying for that grid through its bills, just in the same way as it has paid for all the delivery to date. And that the way we spread the cost of these investments out over the maximum number of people, some part of that grid investment will come through the normal levies that everybody pays in their household bill. People shouldn't really see any great adjustment in their bills from this. It isn't going to be a huge shock to anybody's bill, but people will be paying for the grid over the course of the coming years. This grid investment, by the way, Ireland's far from unique. Every country is going to have to invest enormously in its grid. Every single country. Obviously, we're trying to build our interconnection to other countries. We're currently connected to GB through a number of interconnectors. We're building a connection to France. DC would like to try and push out, have more connections, because that, again, increases the resilience of the grid. It means that we have more sources of power. We can diversify our sources of power. And crucially, we can reduce the amount of fossil fuel that we use to create that power.
And then 3 very quick fire type questions to finish. I suppose one is the cost regime. Where is that? And again, that's another area where I imagine there's interaction between yourselves and the Custom House. But it seems to be a core part of commencing the judicial review aspects of the Planning and Development Act. So there's groups meeting on that and it's progressing.
That's correct, yes. So there's an interdepartmental group that's been working away on that. It is progressing. Some parts of the judicial review provisions can be commenced without it, but we are working away on that. And I think there's to be meetings in the coming days, actually, to see can we bring that to a finalisation and bring a decision to government on that.
When do you think that we're going to have the solar guidelines and the revised wind guidelines? Or in your mind, when would you like these things to be closed off? There
have been various delays that have caused the wind energy guidelines to be pushed out, I think, and just, various new developments, including from Europe, that need to be incorporated in them. I suspect they're probably further advanced than solar, but I would hope that we would see guidelines on both of those areas, in the coming year, maybe year and a half, perhaps. But I wouldn't have a firm figure on that because, as I say, it's not entirely 100% within my control.
And then last, because you did mention storms and changing weather patterns and stuff like that, and something very close to my heart is resilience and adaptation and stuff like that. There's this suggestion that there'll be a sectoral adaptation plan for the planning and built environment sector, which again is something that I suppose adaptation policy is under yourselves, and then you're relying on the other departments to do their thing. Is that a priority for you on the adaptation side of the house?
While we have overall leadership on the whole of government response, we have direct responsibility, obviously, on the energy side. So we'll be working very hard to try and ensure that we have a very robust sectoral adaptation plan for the energy side. And obviously, as you say, Storm Éowyn is Exhibit A as to why we need it.
Oonagh, thanks a million for all that.
Pleasure.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.